Everybody. In this video, we're going to be talking about rubrics, and we're going to be looking at rubrics with a cold, hard, Clint Eastwood-esque stare. We're going to call this series The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly about rubrics. Many of you will be familiar with rubrics, but if you're not, here's just the basics about what a rubric is. Essentially, it's a scoring guide used to evaluate the quality of any given assignment. It's usually broken down into three main features. Those are the criteria that it will be evaluated on, the quality definitions, and also a scoring strategy. Typically, we see that these aren't usually used for smaller assignments, things that are usually worth about 5%. We normally don't have a rubric attached to them. They just have some sort of other type of learning or scoring criteria outlined. And we've also seen, which we'll get to in a little bit, that they are declining in some circles in favor of more of a top performance rubric. And I'm going to show you what that looks like on the next slide. Now, this is an example of something that could be referred to as a top performance rubric. And in this one, we're only giving the criteria for the top level of performance, meaning we're not changing it for level 3, level 2, level 1, making small changes in the wording as the level of the material goes down. What we're doing in this one is just saying this is what sort of the perfect assignment looks like. This is just the top criteria for an assignment. And actually, this is quite easy to build in Blackboard as well, so you can build this type of rubric in Blackboard. And if you need some help with how to do that, please feel free to set up a meeting in person with myself, Mark Dorsey, or you can send me an email and I'll explain how to do that. Many of you are already using rubrics, are already very familiar with rubrics. So I want you to pause the video for a second, take a second to reflect on what are the pros and cons of using rubrics for assessment. Oftentimes we use them because that's always the way it's been done, but what are some pros and cons that you've encountered when it comes to using rubrics? In terms of what some past faculty have said, many have agreed that it's more efficient from a marking perspective. It also acts as a good guide of instructions for the students on what it is that they need to do. In terms of some cons, sometimes the language can be a bit vague. Sometimes you've created a rubric and it's not really reflecting what it is that you're hoping that students learn, and you don't realize that until it's a little bit too late. So we've had a number of different brainstorm sessions with other groups. So I want you guys to think about what are some good and bad things about rubrics? Let's first take a look at the good. In terms of rubrics, one thing that they do is they provide consistent and uniform standards. They act as sort of a sense of objectivity in what can be oftentimes very subjective topics out there. So it's consistent, it's uniform, students appreciate that. As was mentioned on the last slide, they also make marking very quick and efficient. So sometimes, you don't have to write out numerous comments. You can just keep your comment short because the rubric is going to indicate some of those comments that you otherwise would have said. For students, it acts as a guide for them, also provides feedback to them. When you select the criteria that you've given students, it gives them that as feedback. And also, students have just come to expect rubrics. They're so familiar with them from elementary school, from high school, from other post-secondary courses that they've taken. They're often going to ask you for rubrics, and therefore you might get less complaints. It'll also help in case somebody contests their mark. Having that rubric will be helpful in that situation as well. Well, rubrics can identify very clearly different uniform standards and expectations for an assignment. Some people would argue that they give the appearance of objectiveness, but really what they're doing is they still involve a lot of human judgment. And human judgment is always imprecise and somewhat subjective as well. So I've got an example here that shows you how sometimes the adjectives that we use on rubrics are often very murky, giving teachers a lot of discretion, which can be a good thing, but also just keep in mind that the adjectives that you're using, the words that you're using in your rubric, they still are somewhat subjective. For instance, I've got one here, and this particular section of the rubric is for organization and evidence. of sources, and the difference between strongly conveys the topic and clearly conveys the topic and conveys a topic and does not convey a topic. Some of those are very clear, but the difference between strongly and clearly is somewhat subjective. Similarly with expertly organized versus well organized. So it gives the appearance of objectiveness, but there still is room for the teacher to have some sort of say in that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. In terms of some of the bad things about rubrics, I've heard students talk about them in terms of, just a way to justify a bad mark. If students got something wrong, the teacher can then pull out the rubric and say, here, look at this. This proves that you knew what you were supposed to do. So sometimes students see it as less of a benefit, just a way to justify a bad mark. The other thing is students may not look at them. Think about your own faculty evaluations. When you receive your faculty evaluations, what is more meaningful to you? Is it the comments that students provide, or is it the checklist that they check off? I know personally from my own experience, I value the comments a lot. I value both parts of that faculty evaluation, but the comments tend to mean a lot to me. So remember that when you're assessing your own students as well, and when you're measuring how they do on an assignment, that the comments are meaningful to students as well. Now, this is one of the bad aspects of rubrics that you might want to talk to an instructional technologist about it, because they might be able to explain this a little bit more clearly. But in Blackboard, you can't enter a specific mark if you're using a point or percentage range. So if you're using a range, let's say from 1.5 to 4.5, Blackboard will break up that range into 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, and 4.5. It'll give you a drop-down list, and you can select one of those. You cannot give somebody 1.3, for instance, or 2.7. So that list can't be altered. None of those in-between marks will work. So in some cases, that can somewhat tie your hands. So just keep that in mind when you are using rubrics in Blackboard. Now let's look at rubrics and the ugly side of rubrics. There's been a lot of research on rubrics in the last decade, and a lot of them have focused on some of the more negative aspects of rubrics because they've become so entrenched in learning and education that people are starting to wonder whether they are effective or not. Some things that have been pointed to are that high scores on rubrics don't necessarily mean the assignment is any good. I know in my own experience, I've created a rubric, and then when I go to actually end up marking it, my rubric doesn't necessarily accurately reflect what I'm expecting students to do. And now I'm constricted because I've given them this rubric and I have to use this rubric. So for example, if you had an essay assignment and a student did really well on organization, they had proper paragraphs, APA formatting was there, they used some sources and had evidence, but you really couldn't even read the paper because the spelling and grammar was so bad. Depending on how you set up your rubric and how much weighting was given to spelling and grammar in the other sections, the student could still end up with a B easily. And yet you have a paper that you can't even read, but the organization, formatting, and evidence are there. So that's an example of when a rubric might be quite constricting for you. Another ugly aspect is that if you don't have a rubrics, students will certainly ask for one. They've come to expect them, so especially on large assignments, many of them are going to ask for a rubric if you don't give them one. Some people have made the argument, are they able to even function unless every required item is spelled out for them in a grid and assigned a point value? Some of them might look like the girl in this picture going, I don't know what I'm supposed to do without a rubric. And is that a good thing that we're teaching students? Should students always have clearly outlined items that they need to finish in order to do well on the project? Or is there room for more creativity in there without a rubric? While doing some research on rubrics, I came across this discussion board post, and you can see the title right away applies to us. I hate rubrics for grading, especially for papers. They sap the creativity out of writing them and turn them into a nuts and bolts kind of thing. Now, this is coming from a student, so it's a very, very interesting perspective on it. And then the student goes on to talk about online classes. They're more challenging sometimes than taking classes on campus, usually more reading and writing. That can definitely be true. And he says that, or she says that you probably will run across grading rubrics more. This may make the teacher's job easier, but for me, they take any other joy out of writing scholarly papers. And I'm saying this as somebody who really likes to write. So some interesting insights there from a student about the use of rubrics and why students are using or why teachers are using the rubrics. Perhaps students are, looking at it from the perspective that it's just making the teacher's job easier. So again, like the earlier comment, if you are going to use rubrics, they do make things easier, but it's also very helpful to provide comments for students as well. And the final ugly part that I'm going to look in at before we go into best practices is that our rubrics, sucking the creativity out of assignments, something that was talked about in one of the previous slides. Are they turning our students into robots? They are designed to function as scoring guidelines. Some people would argue that at their extreme, they're just agents of control over what is being taught and valued. And that standardization is good if you're trying to produce robots, but trying to understand whether students their ideas are being expressed, that's something that's completely different. And one study by Mabry in 1999 concluded that compliance with the rubric tended to yield higher scores, but produced vacuous writing, meaning this sort of empty writing. That they were getting high scores because they completed the rubric, but in terms of the actual writing itself, that it was pretty empty and not creative, and didn't show a clear understanding of the ideas. So we've talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly of rubric. Now it's time to talk about some best practices to make sure that if we are using rubrics, that we're using them to their greatest potential. Always remember rubrics should be about learning. Scoring a rubric may help with grading, but it doesn't necessarily help the student's mastery of content or skills. So you need to be less concerned with grading and more concerned with learning. And how you do that in a rubric is make sure that your rubrics describe performance traits, but don't narrowly prescribe them. So we don't want to be specifically telling students exactly what they need to do, but we need to be providing sometimes more general descriptions of what it is that we're expecting. One of the things that you can do is try and create some flexibility inside your rubrics. And again, it's more about describing certain things than prescribing certain things. Make sure that in your rubrics you leave space for comments. Make sure that the language that you're using is somewhat flexible so that if you need to change some things up, if you find out that the rubric wasn't exactly perfect for your purposes, then you can do that. One of the things that I've found extremely successful in my classes for making rubrics is trying to have the students help you construct a new rubric, or at least modify an existing one. So go through the rubric with them and ask them about the rubric. Do they think that it accurately reflects the learning that they're being expected to do or to demonstrate? Doing that with them will give them a sense of ownership over the rubric. Everybody's clear on the same page and the students have participated in the building of that. In Blackboard, it will give you the option of choosing a points-based or percent-based rubric. So keep in mind that if you want to create a rubric that you can use on multiple assignments, oftentimes a percent-based rubric is more flexible, so giving percentages rather than just giving points. For instance, if you create a rubric that you want to use on all of your papers, from a short response to a final research paper, a percentage-based rubric will more easily convert amongst assignments. If the final research paper is worth 25% and the short response is worth 5%, and students are expected to do the same thing, but the points are different, it's going to be more helpful to keep it in a percentage-based. And just some final comments about best practices. Usually people have found that the more detailed the rubric is, the better. However, as I was mentioning earlier, be careful with too much detail when a general comment would fit. Be sure that your details, your level of detail doesn't constrict you later on when it actually comes to marking and evaluating how much students have learned or demonstrated that learning. Also, keep in mind that too many vertical columns might be confusing and restricting. Do you really need to have 8 columns in a rubric when 3 or 4 would suffice? And then some research by De Silva has gone on to show that students perform significantly better when the teacher explains the rubric rather than just handing it out. So oftentimes we take for granted that we think that students are going to read the rubric, we might pass it out, they might not even look at it. So spend some time to go over with the rubric, hand the rubric out, give it out online. tell students to take a look at them and maybe ask for them, create a discussion board and ask for them to put their comments about the rubric inside that discussion board, or ask them to send you any emails if they have any questions. Another good strategy would be to create your own screencast that goes over the rubric in detail for them. All of those would be good options to help make sure that students are performing better and using the rubric to their advantage. So this was just a quick look at rubrics, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm a believer in rubrics for big assignments, but we really need to be thinking about how we're using rubrics and whether they're actually improving student learning. So keep in mind these best practices when you are putting together your rubrics for an online course.